The mansion was bigger than anyone could imagine. Its walls gleamed with polished marble, and golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow across the room. The air smelled faintly of expensive perfumes and fresh flowers. Guests walked carefully, trying not to stumble on the intricate rugs that covered every inch of the floor. They whispered quietly, admiring the wealth and the elegance around them. Everyone seemed aware of the importance of this gathering, and yet there was a subtle tension, like something unseen was waiting to happen. At the center of it all stood the billionaire, tall and confident. His suit was perfectly tailored, and his presence made people both respect and fear him at the same time. He had invited some of the most powerful and wealthy individuals from around the world, and all of them had come hoping to gain favor or insight into his world. They were used to being in control, used to being the smartest in the room, but tonight felt different, even before anything had happened. The guests sipped their champagne carefully, eyes darting around to see who was present. Conversations flowed, but there was a polite stiffness to them. Everyone spoke with caution, careful not to say anything that could offend or reveal ignorance. The billionaire, as always, watched quietly, letting the room settle into its rhythm. He had a way of observing people that made them feel exposed without even speaking. Many felt they were performing, showing the best parts of themselves, hiding the flaws. Among all this grandeur, there moved someone who was barely noticed. A maid, quietly going about her tasks, carried trays with hors d'oeuvres and drinks. Her uniform was simple, her hair neatly tied back, and her movements were precise but gentle. She had been working in this mansion for several years, and over time, she had learned to understand the unspoken language of the wealthy. She knew when someone was pretending, when someone was anxious, and when someone was truly powerful. Her eyes, dark and observant, moved constantly, taking in every detail. She was small in presence but large in understanding. The billionaire spoke suddenly, a sound breaking the quiet murmurs of the room. He said a phrase in Arabic, clear and commanding. The room froze. Some guests looked at each other, unsure of what had just been said. Some tried to smile politely, hoping no one noticed their confusion. The words hung in the air, like a puzzle that only some could understand. The guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the billionaire had introduced something they could not immediately grasp. No one responded. No one moved. No one even breathed audibly. It was as if the room had stopped to wait for someone to reveal the meaning of the words. The silence was heavy, pressing against everyone's chest. The billionaire's eyes scanned the room, sharp and calculating, as if weighing each person for their reaction. Most guests remained frozen, their smiles awkward, their minds racing to find a response that would save face. Then, she moved. The maid, who had been silently walking past, paused. Her eyes softened, a quiet understanding appearing on her face. She spoke softly, barely above a whisper, repeating the phrase or acknowledging its meaning. It was not loud or attention-seeking, but it was confident and correct. The room's atmosphere changed immediately. The unspoken challenge had been met, and only one person had answered it. Gasps filled the room, small and scattered at first, then growing. The guests turned their heads toward her, realizing that the one who had truly understood was not a billionaire, not a diplomat, not a famous investor, but the maid. Her knowledge, her awareness, had suddenly elevated her above the pomp and pretense surrounding them. The billionaire's gaze lingered on her, something almost like a quiet approval in his eyes. The others shifted, some with embarrassment, some with awe, all suddenly aware of the assumptions they had made. It was a moment that changed the energy in the room. People who had arrived thinking they were in control now realized that the power of observation and understanding was not limited to wealth or status. The maid, carrying nothing but a tray, had shown a depth that few could match. She returned to her tasks, moving with the same quiet grace as before, but the room had changed. Conversations resumed, but now with a new tension. People were aware that intelligence and awareness could come from unexpected places. The billionaire did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to settle, letting the impact of the moment sink in. His presence remained commanding, but now it was accompanied by a subtle respect. The maid had shown more than comprehension. She had shown courage, insight, and humility. It was a combination that drew the attention of the most powerful person in the room. The other guests, meanwhile, were left to reflect on their own behavior. They had assumed that understanding and power were linked to their social standing. But they had been proven wrong in the most unexpected way. The maid moved past tables, refilling glasses, placing small plates carefully. She smiled occasionally, polite but not seeking acknowledgement. Her silence was powerful. She needed no words to assert her presence. Guests found themselves stealing glances, some secretly admiring her intelligence, others silently acknowledging their own misjudgment. It was a subtle revolution, quiet yet profound. The room, filled with people used to commanding attention, had been humbled by someone who existed largely in the background. In the kitchen, the maid paused for a moment. She leaned against the counter, her thoughts quiet but sharp. She had learned to see the world clearly, to observe without judgment, to understand without seeking credit. Tonight her patience and awareness had spoken louder than anyone's wealth or influence. She smiled faintly, knowing that the evening had taken a turn she could not have imagined, yet one she had been ready for all along. Meanwhile, the billionaire spoke again, this time in a calm voice that carried a weight of authority. He addressed the room, praising an aspect of conversation or culture that required understanding, subtly acknowledging the maid's correct response without singling her out publicly. The guests nodded, trying to follow his lead, some relieved to move on, some still grappling with the realization that they had been overshadowed by someone they considered invisible. The rest of the evening unfolded with the same elegance and precision as it had begun. Yet there was a difference in the air. The maid continued her work quietly, efficiently, and with a presence that could not be ignored. The guests were more mindful, less arrogant, more aware that appearances could deceive. The billionaire, ever observant, watched the subtle shifts in behavior with satisfaction. He had seen many things in his life, but tonight had reminded him that insight often comes from the most unexpected sources. When the evening finally ended, and the guests departed, they left with more than just memories of luxury and elegance. They left with a lesson, that true understanding and courage could not be bought, and that wisdom could be found in the quietest corners of even the grandest places. The maid, returning to her simple quarters in the mansion, felt a quiet pride, not for recognition but for the knowledge that she had acted rightly and observed well. The night had changed, not in grand gestures but in subtle acknowledgments and the silent power of perception. In the days that followed, the story of that evening would ripple quietly through social circles. Guests would speak of the billionaire's words, the unexpected response, and the remarkable presence of the maid. Some would reflect on their own assumptions and the biases they carried. The maid herself remained unchanged, carrying on with her duties, but the room she moved through had been permanently altered. Her insight, quiet yet profound, had left an imprint that no wealth, no status, could erase. It was a night that would be remembered not for extravagance or wealth, but for the simple truth that intelligence and awareness often come from the most overlooked and underestimated people. The billionaire's choice of words had been deliberate, a test of perception. The maid's reaction had been natural, an honest display of understanding. Together, they had created a moment of revelation, humility, and respect. It was a story of quiet courage, subtle power, and the undeniable strength of observation. The mansion, grand and imposing, had witnessed something far more valuable than gold or influence. It had witnessed the truth that the next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the mansion, casting long shadows on the polished floors. The previous night's event still lingered in the minds of the guests, many of whom were quietly sharing stories among themselves. Their words carried curiosity, admiration, and in some cases, a touch of shame. The evening had reminded them that wealth and position were not the only measures of insight and understanding. Some felt humbled, others annoyed, but all had been reminded of a truth they often ignored. Inside the mansion, the maid moved silently through the corridors, carrying baskets of fresh linens and cleaning supplies. Her steps were measured and her eyes always alert, observing the details of the house and the people within it. She had become more than just someone who maintained the mansion. She was a part of its unseen rhythm. She understood the moods, the tensions, and the small gestures that revealed far more than words could. Last night's event had been unusual, even for her, yet she treated it with quiet dignity, as if such moments were just part of life's intricate weave. In the study, the billionaire sat alone, sipping a cup of dark coffee. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. He stared at the city skyline through the large windows, his mind replaying the previous evening. He had watched the reactions of every guest, noting the hesitation, the arrogance, and the discomfort. But it was the maid who had captured his attention most. She had seen, understood, and responded without hesitation. Her presence had been quiet yet commanding, and her intelligence had shone in a way that no wealth or title could replicate. He found himself thinking about her long after the party ended. There was something in the clarity of her observation, the honesty of her reaction, and the courage to speak that stood out. It was not the kind of intelligence that could be measured by degrees or certificates. It was instinctive, intuitive, and perceptive. It reminded him that true understanding often came from those who watched and listened carefully, rather than those who shouted to be heard. Meanwhile, the guests began to trickle back into the mansion over the next few days for business meetings and social calls. The tension from the previous night had not faded entirely. People approached conversations with more care, thinking twice before speaking. Many had observed her reaction, and it had unsettled their sense of superiority. They realized that the maid had seen through their facades, and it had silently shamed them. The maid continued her work as if nothing had happened. She carried trays, polished surfaces, and dusted shelves, yet her movements carried a quiet confidence that had not gone unnoticed. Those who observed her closely began to understand that her awareness extended beyond household duties. She could read a room, understand unspoken dynamics, and navigate complex social situations without ever needing acknowledgement. Her insight was subtle yet powerful, and it commanded respect in its own way. One afternoon, the billionaire called her into the library. The room was filled with sunlight, dust motes floating gently in the air. She entered quietly, curtsying slightly as was customary, yet there was a spark of curiosity in her eyes. He motioned for her to sit on a chair opposite him. His tone was calm but firm, carrying the weight of authority without intimidation. He spoke in Arabic this time, slowly and deliberately, asking a question about a phrase, a proverb, and its meaning. The maid listened attentively, her eyes steady and thoughtful. Without hesitation, she answered correctly, explaining not just the literal meaning but the cultural nuance behind it. Her explanation was simple yet profound, revealing an understanding that went beyond words. He leaned back in his chair, studying her closely, a faint smile appearing on his face. He had expected knowledge, but he found wisdom. The billionaire then asked her a series of questions, each one slightly more complex than the last. She responded calmly, accurately, and thoughtfully. With each answer, he realized that her perception and intelligence were extraordinary. She had grown up in a different world, far from wealth and influence, yet she had an understanding that few people in that mansion, or in his world, could match. Her knowledge was not just book learning. It was experience, observation, and insight. It was intelligence shaped by life, not opportunity. During this time, other staff members watched with curiosity and amazement. They had long seen her as diligent and quiet, but now they began to recognize the depth of her abilities. They noticed her keen observation, her patience, and her ability to navigate delicate situations without conflict. Slowly, they began to understand that her quiet presence was far more powerful than anyone had realized. The billionaire decided to test her further. He introduced her to more complex situations, asking for her opinion on guest behaviors, decisions he had to make, and subtle dynamics he observed in his business and social circles. She responded with clarity, honesty, and tact. Her insights were sharp, revealing patterns that even seasoned advisors often missed. The billionaire found himself increasingly relying on her judgment. Not openly, not in meetings with others, but in private, her perspective became invaluable. It was a revelation. Someone so underestimated could see the truth so clearly. The maid, however, remained humble. She did not seek recognition, reward, or attention. She worked diligently, observed carefully, and spoke when asked. Her presence was steady and reliable, and her wisdom came quietly without fanfare. She understood the world she lived in, and she navigated it with intelligence and grace. Her actions spoke louder than words, proving that knowledge and awareness could command respect without demanding it. The billionaire, impressed by her insight, began to include her subtly in matters that required discretion and judgment. He valued her opinion on things others would never consider asking a maid. She provided clarity where others saw confusion, and her perspective often revealed solutions that had been overlooked. In her quiet way, she began to influence decisions that affected the lives and fortunes of many, without ever seeking acknowledgement or praise. One evening, the mansion hosted another gathering. This time the guests were curious, having heard whispers about the events of the previous night. The atmosphere was still formal, but there was an undercurrent of tension. People wanted to observe, to understand, and perhaps to regain some sense of control. The billionaire, watching from his usual place, allowed the event to unfold naturally, letting the dynamics play out. As the evening progressed, he spoke again in Arabic, a more complex phrase this time. Eyes darted nervously across the room, waiting for someone to react. Again, no one responded, hesitation filling the air. The maid, however, once more showed comprehension. She acknowledged the phrase subtly, a slight nod or a quiet murmur that indicated understanding. The room shifted instantly. Conversations paused, and the guests became acutely aware that the same woman who had surprised them before had done so again. Her awareness and intelligence were undeniable. The guests, now more conscious of their assumptions, tried to follow the conversation more attentively. Some attempted to appear knowledgeable while others fell silent, unsure of how to engage without revealing ignorance. The billionaire's gaze often returned to the maid, a quiet acknowledgement of her insight passing between them. She did not seek attention, but her understanding continued to command respect, subtly reshaping the room's dynamics. After the gathering, the mansion returned to its usual rhythm. The maid went about her duties, moving through the grand halls with the same quiet confidence. The billionaire continued to reflect on her insight, considering how much influence a single, perceptive mind could have in his world. He realized that wisdom often came from the least expected sources, and that respect earned quietly could be more powerful than that demanded loudly. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. The maid's quiet presence, intelligence, and perceptiveness became known within the household, even if the guests remained unaware. Staff members learned to trust her judgment, observing her interactions and learning from her subtle guidance. Her influence grew not through authority, but through consistent, thoughtful action. She had become an indispensable presence, shaping outcomes in ways few could recognize yet everyone felt. The billionaire, more aware than ever of the value of her insight, continued to involve her in matters where discretion, understanding, and perception were critical. She responded with the same quiet intelligence, never overstepping, never seeking acknowledgement, always observing and providing clarity. Her actions spoke volumes, and the mansion, once just a house of luxury, had become a place where true understanding and wisdom quietly thrived. Sight knows no boundaries, and awareness requires no title. The days passed quietly in the mansion, but beneath the calm surface, small ripples of change continued. The guests who visited frequently were more cautious, more thoughtful, more aware that appearances could be deceiving. They observed, they listened, and they reflected on the maid who had quietly challenged their assumptions. She had become a silent force within the house, moving among them without drawing attention, yet her presence influenced the atmosphere profoundly. The billionaire noticed this shift with interest. He had long understood the dynamics of power and influence, but the subtle impact of someone so underestimated intrigued him. The maid's quiet intelligence reminded him that real insight often came from observation and experience rather than wealth or authority. He began to consider her role in ways he had never considered before, appreciating the depth of understanding that she brought to every situation. One morning, the billionaire requested her presence in the office. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the rows of books and the polished wood surfaces. She entered quietly, placing her hands together as a sign of respect. He gestured for her to sit, and she complied, eyes steady and calm. He did not waste words immediately, instead observing her for a long moment. He saw patience, composure, and a clarity of thought that many in his world lacked. He asked her to evaluate a set of documents, contracts that carried significant financial and personal implications. Her hands moved gently across the papers, and her eyes scanned carefully, noting details that even experienced advisors had overlooked. She spoke in a calm, deliberate tone, explaining potential risks and opportunities, all in a way that was clear and understandable. Her insight was practical and sharp, yet delivered with humility. He listened intently, impressed by the depth and precision of her observations. Over the next few weeks, her role expanded subtly. She was asked to provide opinions on cultural nuances, potential reactions of business partners, and even the emotional undertones in conversations. Each time, her assessments were accurate, thoughtful, and insightful. The billionaire began to rely on her perspective, not because of her title or social standing, but because of her understanding. She had an ability to see beyond appearances, to recognize patterns, and to understand motivations that others missed. The staff, too, began to notice the shift. They watched her with new respect, recognizing the quiet influence she wielded. She continued to perform her duties diligently, moving seamlessly among the mansion's rooms, yet her presence carried weight. Her words, when spoken, were considered and meaningful. She had become an unseen advisor, someone whose judgment was trusted implicitly, even if not publicly acknowledged. One afternoon, a group of prominent guests arrived for a meeting. The atmosphere was formal and tense, with the usual undercurrent of competition and self-importance. The billionaire observed quietly, allowing the conversation to unfold. As expected, some guests spoke with arrogance, some with hesitation, and some with thinly veiled attempts to impress. The maid, unnoticed by most, observed them all with a quiet intensity. She noted the tone of voices, the shifts in posture, the subtle gestures that revealed more than words. The billionaire addressed a complex question to the group, phrased in Arabic, knowing that most would not understand. The guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Once again, it was the maid who reacted, acknowledging the meaning with calm understanding. Her response, subtle but correct, created an immediate shift in the room's dynamic. The guests realized that she understood something they could not, and their composure faltered. After the meeting, the billionaire invited her to walk with him through the mansion's gardens. The air was cool, filled with the scent of flowers and fresh grass. He asked her about her observations during the gathering, seeking her honest opinion. She spoke clearly, pointing out subtleties and dynamics that were easily missed. Her ability to perceive not just actions but intentions fascinated him. Her perspective was practical, insightful, and unclouded by ego or ambition. He began to ask her questions that tested her understanding further. He presented scenarios, challenges, and hypothetical situations, and she responded with clarity and precision. Her reasoning was logical yet sensitive to human emotion and cultural context. He realized that her insight was a rare combination of intellect, empathy, and experience. She could navigate both the practical and the subtle aspects of life in ways few could. Meanwhile, the mansion staff continued to respect and admire her, recognizing the depth of her intelligence and her calm authority. She remained humble, performing her duties without seeking recognition. Her influence was felt quietly but strongly. She had become the person people turned to, even unconsciously, for understanding, guidance, and clarity. The billionaire, increasingly aware of her value, began to rely on her for more than just insight into guests and documents. He sought her advice on personal matters, subtle decisions that required careful judgment. She responded with wisdom, not imposing her views but offering thoughtful guidance. Her ability to see beyond the obvious, to understand motives and emotions, made her indispensable. He found himself appreciating her judgment more than he had expected, recognizing the rare combination of intelligence, perception, and humility she embodied. One evening, a large gathering was held in the mansion, bringing together influential figures from different countries. The guests arrived in their finest attire, confident in their knowledge and social skills. The atmosphere was charged with expectation, each person hoping to stand out or gain favor. The billionaire allowed the event to proceed naturally, observing closely as dynamics unfolded. He spoke in Arabic again, a phrase that carried cultural significance. The guests froze, uncertain how to respond, their confidence wavering. The maid, as always, reacted immediately, demonstrating understanding with a subtle acknowledgement. The room shifted. Conversations paused, glances were exchanged, and the guests became acutely aware of her insight. She had once more proven that knowledge and perception were not confined to status or wealth. The billionaire's gaze lingered on her, a faint smile of recognition playing across his face. He valued her understanding, her courage to react honestly, and her ability to convey insight without arrogance. The guests, meanwhile, were left to reflect on their assumptions, realizing that they had underestimated someone who moved quietly among them. Her presence had subtly shifted the balance of power, reminding them that wisdom and observation could surpass wealth and influence. After the gathering, the mansion returned to its quiet rhythm. The maid continued her work, moving through the rooms with grace and precision. The billionaire reflected on the events, increasingly aware of the importance of her perspective. He considered her insight invaluable, not because of her social standing, but because of her ability to perceive, understand, and respond thoughtfully. Her influence was quiet yet profound, shaping outcomes and decisions without ever seeking recognition. Days turned into weeks, and her reputation within the mansion grew quietly. The staff respected her judgment, the billionaire relied on her insight, and even the guests began to notice in subtle ways that she was someone whose understanding could not be ignored. Her influence was a testament to the power of observation, patience, and intelligence. She had proven that true wisdom did not require wealth, status, or recognition. It required perception, understanding, and courage. The mansion, grand and imposing, had become more than a place of luxury. It had become a space where insight, observation, and quiet influence shaped the lives and decisions of those within it. The maid, moving among the grand halls and gardens, carried this influence with humility and grace. She had shown that even in a world dominated by wealth and status, the quiet mind could see clearly, act wisely, and change the course of events without fanfare or acknowledgement. The billionaire, observing all this, continued to reflect on the rare combination of qualities she embodied. Her intelligence, perception, and humility created a presence that was impossible to ignore, yet impossible to exaggerate. She influenced without demanding attention, guided without imposing authority, and observed without judgment. Her role in the mansion had become indispensable, not because of what she carried, but because of how she saw, understood, and responded. She had transformed the quiet spaces of the mansion into arenas of insight and understanding, where true perception held power greater than any title, wealth, or display of influence. The mansion had settled into its rhythm, a quiet rhythm that carried the echoes of previous events. The guests, though still influential and confident in their wealth, were now more cautious in their interactions. They had learned that not everyone who appeared invisible lacked insight, and the memory of the maid's quiet reaction lingered in their minds. Conversations became more thoughtful, polite smiles more genuine, and a subtle respect permeated the air. The maid moved through the mansion as always, performing her duties with grace and precision. She dusted the shelves, arranged flowers, and ensured that everything was in its place. Yet beneath her calm exterior she remained alert, watching the interactions of those around her. She had learned to read people with an instinctive understanding, noting shifts in tone, subtle gestures, and hidden meanings. Her awareness was a quiet power, shaping the environment in ways most could not see. One morning, the billionaire called her to the library. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the polished floors and the rows of books. She entered quietly, placing her hands together, her posture respectful yet confident. He gestured for her to sit, and she did, her eyes steady and attentive. He spoke first, his tone calm but deliberate, asking her opinion on a sensitive matter involving a business partner who had been difficult in negotiations. She listened carefully, considering each word before responding. Her answer was clear, concise, and thoughtful. She explained the potential outcomes, the underlying motivations, and the subtleties that could affect the negotiations. Her perspective was practical and insightful, grounded in observation and understanding rather than assumption. The billionaire nodded slowly, impressed by her clarity and accuracy. Her insight had a depth that few advisors, no matter how experienced, could match. As days went by, her role in the mansion subtly expanded. She was asked to provide her observations on social gatherings, on potential alliances, and on the emotional undercurrents of conversations. Each time her responses were precise and insightful. She could see patterns, understand intentions, and anticipate outcomes with remarkable accuracy. Her intelligence was not flashy, nor was it boastful, but it was undeniable. The billionaire began to rely on her judgment more and more, valuing her quiet wisdom above the opinions of others. The staff noticed her growing influence, and a quiet respect developed among them. They had always seen her as diligent and capable, but now they recognized the depth of her understanding. She guided them subtly, teaching by example rather than instruction. Her presence was steady, her advice practical, and her demeanor calm. She had become the anchor of the household, ensuring that everything ran smoothly while quietly shaping the decisions and perspectives of those around her. One evening, the mansion hosted a grand event. The guests arrived dressed in their finest attire, their confidence evident in every step. The atmosphere was filled with polite conversation, subtle competition, and the expectation of influence. The billionaire observed quietly, allowing the dynamics to unfold naturally. As always, he was attentive to details, noting the smallest gestures and shifts in behavior. During the event, he spoke in Arabic, a phrase that carried meaning beyond its literal words. The guests, unfamiliar with the language, hesitated. Their uncertainty created a brief tension, a pause in the conversation. The maid, as before, reacted immediately, acknowledging the phrase with understanding. Her response was subtle, yet it shifted the energy in the room. Conversations paused, glances were exchanged, and the guests realized that she understood something they could not. The billionaire's gaze lingered on her, a quiet acknowledgement of her insight. He valued her understanding, her courage to respond honestly, and her ability to perceive truth without seeking recognition. The guests, now aware of her intelligence, became more cautious, their confidence tempered by the realization that appearances could be deceiving. The maid's quiet power had once again reshaped the dynamics of the room, demonstrating that wisdom and perception were not confined to status or wealth. After the event, the mansion returned to its calm routine. The maid continued her work with grace and efficiency, moving through the halls, arranging the rooms, and ensuring that everything was in order. The billionaire reflected on the events, increasingly aware of the importance of her perspective. Her insight was invaluable, not because of her position, but because of her ability to see clearly, understand deeply, and respond thoughtfully. Her presence had become indispensable. In the days that followed, the maid's influence continued to grow quietly. She was consulted on matters requiring subtle judgment, asked for her observations on guests and staff alike, and valued for her clarity of thought. She provided insight without imposing her will, guided without demanding attention, and observed without judgment. Her quiet intelligence shaped the mansion, its people, and its decisions in ways that were profound yet understated. The billionaire, recognizing her unique abilities, began to involve her in more significant matters. He sought her advice on delicate decisions, relying on her perspective to navigate complex social and business situations. Her understanding of human nature, her ability to read subtle cues, and her calm judgment made her an invaluable confidant. She offered clarity where others saw confusion, guidance where others saw uncertainty, and insight where others saw complexity. One afternoon, the billionaire took her to the garden. The sun was warm, the air fragrant with blooming flowers, and the atmosphere calm. He asked her to reflect on a recent negotiation, to provide her thoughts on how the situation could be handled with tact and effectiveness. She spoke clearly, considering every angle and potential outcome. Her advice was practical, nuanced, and insightful. The billionaire listened carefully, valuing her judgment more than ever. Meanwhile, the staff and guests alike continued to observe her with quiet admiration. They had learned that her intelligence and awareness were not limited to her role as a maid. She understood people, situations, and outcomes in ways that were rare and valuable. Her influence was subtle but powerful, shaping the mansion and the decisions made within it without seeking recognition or praise. As time passed, the mansion became more than just a house of wealth and luxury. It became a place where insight, observation, and quiet influence shaped the actions and decisions of those within it. The maid, moving among the halls and gardens with grace and efficiency, carried this influence with humility and wisdom. She had shown that true understanding did not require status, wealth, or recognition. It required observation, empathy, and thoughtful judgment. The billionaire, reflecting on her unique abilities, continued to rely on her perspective in matters both practical and personal. Her calm intelligence, perceptive insight, and quiet influence made her an indispensable presence. She guided decisions, provided clarity, and observed dynamics that others overlooked. Her presence, once unnoticed, had become central to the mansion's rhythm and the billionaire's understanding of the world around him. The mansion, grand and imposing, had been transformed not by wealth or power, but by the quiet presence of a woman whose insight, awareness, and intelligence could not be ignored. She had demonstrated that true wisdom and understanding could come from unexpected places, that humility and observation could carry more weight than status or authority, and that quiet influence could shape outcomes in profound and lasting ways. The house, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, had become a place where true understanding and human perception held the greatest value. The mansion had grown quiet once again, but the echoes of past gatherings remained in the minds of those who had attended. The guests, now more aware of the subtle intelligence within the household, carried a sense of caution mingled with curiosity. They had learned that the quietest person in the room could hold the sharpest understanding, and that assumption could no longer guide their confidence. The maid moved gracefully through the halls, attending to her duties with a calm precision. Every movement, from dusting the shelves to arranging fresh flowers, was deliberate and thoughtful. Her attention to detail extended far beyond physical tasks. She noticed moods, tensions, and the smallest shifts in the behavior of those around her. Her awareness was an invisible presence that shaped the atmosphere without force or demand. One morning, the billionaire called her to the study. The room was bathed in warm sunlight, and the faint scent of old books mingled with the aroma of fresh coffee. He gestured for her to sit, and she did so, calm and attentive. He spoke in Arabic, posing a complex question that required both cultural understanding and careful reasoning. She listened, her eyes steady and focused, before answering clearly and thoughtfully. Her response revealed insight, empathy, and practical judgment, qualities that far surpassed expectations. The billionaire nodded, his expression one of approval. He had long understood the power of knowledge, but the depth and nuance of her perception continued to impress him. He realized that true intelligence was not simply about knowledge or wealth. It was about understanding, observation, and the ability to act wisely. Her presence in the mansion had become more than a help. It had become essential. Over the following weeks, her role expanded in ways that were subtle but significant. She was consulted on delicate matters, from understanding the intentions of guests to assessing the emotional undercurrents of business decisions. Her insights were accurate, nuanced, and often overlooked by others. She provided clarity where confusion existed, guidance where hesitation lingered, and perspective where bias had clouded judgment. Staff members began to notice the quiet authority she carried. They had always respected her work ethic, but now they recognized her judgment and insight. She guided by example, demonstrating patience, careful observation, and tact. Her influence grew not through assertion, but through the consistent application of thoughtfulness and understanding. Even those who had once underestimated her began to see the depth of her intelligence. One evening, the mansion hosted another gathering of influential guests. The atmosphere was filled with formality, ambition, and the subtle competition of minds. The billionaire observed quietly, allowing the dynamics to unfold naturally. He spoke in Arabic, a phrase layered with cultural meaning. The guests hesitated, their confidence wavering, unsure how to respond. Once again, the maid reacted immediately, acknowledging the phrase with understanding. The room shifted. Glances were exchanged, conversations paused, and the power dynamics subtly changed. Her reaction was calm, almost imperceptible, yet it carried authority. The guests recognized, consciously or not, that she understood something they could not. The billionaire's eyes followed her with a faint smile of approval, acknowledging the quiet but profound influence she held. This moment, like those before it, reinforced the lesson that true understanding was not dictated by wealth, title, or visibility, but by perception, awareness, and the courage to respond honestly.